As a young man in Vermont, Bill Wilson had lived next door to a little lady opium addict who sent him regularly into town to get her medicine. And when Bill was a senior in high school, his girlfriend died when her parents took her for surgery at Fifth Avenue Hospital in New York City to have a tumor removed. And Bill was so unhappy that he failed his German class and dropped out of school and went to live with his mother in Boston, who was an osteopathic doctor. Bill W. made up his German class, and his mother sent him to special tutoring for entrance into MIT at the Massachusetts School of Technology, but Bill failed the entrance exam, so in 1914 he went to Norwich Military School instead, where Bill W. would earn his stripes by standing up for his younger classmates in a hazing incident. Bill W. had grown up on war stories, and he'd gone with his grandfather to hear Woodrow Wilson's speech on the 50th anniversary of Gettysburg. And Bill had been class president in high school and captain of the baseball team, and he sang in the glee club and played in the orchestra. And after the death of his girlfriend, Bill W. started having something like seizures where he couldn't get enough air and he would panic and his stomach would hurt from heartburn and his legs would go numb. The doctors thought that there was something wrong with his heart, but when Bill W. got into military school, his health straightened out right away. Bill W. was sent to Plattsburgh, New York as part of the preparedness movement that was started by Anglophiles who were building officer training schools right after the Lusitania went down. And Vermont was located on the other side of Lake Champlain from Plattsburgh. And during the War of American Independence, Vermont had been doing business with the British. Plattsburgh was attacked on the 6th of September in 1814, and the British surrendered 5 days later on September 11, 1814, after over a dozen warships from both sides had faced off in Lake Champlain. While British warships were bombarding Fort McHenry in Baltimore. The American victory at the Battle of Plattsburgh put a stop to the British invading from Canada, and the Scottish name of Plattsburgh, New York, would be changed in 1951 to the German spelling of Plattsburgh without the H on the end. Bill W. was 8 years younger than Monty, and on the day that A.A. was born on the 10th of June in 1935, Monty was 47 years old and would live for another 41 years, while Bill W. was 39 years old and would live for another 36 years, dying 5 years earlier than Monty. While Bill W. was writing the Big Book, Monty was sent to India for 3 years as an instructor at the Indian Army Staff College after he'd served in Palestine, where he'd been promoted to colonel in June of 1934, and before that, Monty had helped to write the British Infantry Training Manual in 1929. Bill W.'s name had the same meaning as something that was due for payment, as well as its opposite meaning of that which was used to make payment. And Monty's name meant all that could be expected, as in giving something the full Monty, or being the most achievable or the most humanly possible. And Monty also meant the stack of cards left over in a game after each player had taken their share. The name Monty would also come to mean being left naked at the end, and Bill W.'s last drink of Applejack or apple brandy had the denotation of blue ruin or strip and go naked. George Washington had been a minor officer in the British Army at the time that France was being squeezed out of America, and Washington had learned how to fight in the French and Indian War after Spain had lost their armada and been unable to bring troops over to join in the American land grab. From Washington's service in the British Army, he knew that Rogers of Rogers Rangers was steadfastly loyal to England rather than to the colonies. So Washington allowed Rogers only a small commando group called the Queen's Rangers, but they didn't do very well, and Rogers would die alone in poverty in London in 1795. Although George Washington had denied Rogers a commission in the American Army, he'd made Rogers' right-hand man Clark a general, and Clark's brother died of smallpox in 1757 at Fort William A. Henry while the French were accepting Rogers' Rangers' surrender. The day before, they were supposed to be released to the British at Fort Edward, but the local Indians had gotten drunk and murdered all the British prisoners, and then dug up all the dead British and subsequently got the smallpox, and then the fort burned to the ground, and the drunken Indians carried smallpox back to their own villages. Rogers' Rangers were split between the Americans and the British, and many of them had served under Benedict Arnold, who would become a general in Washington's army in 1775 for the War of American Independence. And Benedict Arnold switched sides in 1780 because he hated the French, although he had been an effective commander since 1775 and had helped capture the fort at Ticonderoga and had defended Valcour Island in Lake Champlain. Benedict Arnold was put in command of West Point, overlooking the Hudson River, and when he became a traitor, Benedict Arnold wanted to surrender the fort at West Point to the British, but his plan was discovered and thwarted. Benedict Arnold had been wounded in October of 1777, and they wanted to amputate his leg, but instead they set it 2 inches shorter. And he spent 5 months in bed, recovering, where he started writing letters to some British with complaints and requests for more opium. Because Benedict Arnold would remain unfit for active duty, Washington appointed him commander of Philadelphia, and Benedict Arnold made a great deal of money through his position. And in 1778, he met a British woman and fell in love with her and would expand his business dealings with the British through his wife's friends. After switching sides, Benedict Arnold asked to be posted to the British East India Company, but was made a general for the British instead, and he was told to go fight Americans. And so he burned New London to the ground and murdered surrendering Americans. When Benedict Arnold would die in London in 1801, at the age of 60, he was still complaining of leg pain that was ascribed by the doctors and historians to gout and dropsy. When George Washington became the commander-in-chief of American troops, he brought a German baron over to be the inspector general and to train the American soldiers, and the first U.S. Army manual was written by this Baron von Steuben, whose real name was Frederick Wilhelm Augustus Henry Ferdinand, and the manual was called the Blue Book, and from then on every soldier knew exactly how to survive on the battlefield. The British tried to cut America in two by marching down from Canada along the Hudson Valley to join with Clinton in New York. But the Redcoats, trapped in Saratoga, were forced to surrender to the Americans, and to celebrate the freedom won by America, the Chinese sent fireworks. When George Washington had been down to a few thousand soldiers in 1776, whose conscriptions were expiring on New Year's Day, an Irish patriot told Washington that the English commander holding Trenton was a bad drunk, and so on Christmas Day, Washington crossed the Delaware to attack Trenton, and while it was a small victory, that success gave the Americans the heart to keep up the fight. Many Americans were descended from solid British stock who'd lived in America for over 100 years, and when the English had killed their king in 1649, Parliament passed a law that any 5 English meeting together who were not family members would be arrested, fined, and shipped overseas for 7 years after the 3rd offense. Many of those banished overseas had decided that it was nicer in Australia or in America than it was back in England, and the exiled groups refused to go back to England after their sentence was served, so Parliament revoked the illegal meeting law in 1672, 8 years after its passage, after tens of thousands of the best English minds had been freely transported to America. As the Americans were demanding fair treatment from their British overlords, in 1774, Lord North brought a bill to the English Parliament granting all the Americans' demands except independence. But when the French declared for America, the British turned against America, and the bill failed. France delighted to pay England back for the 7 Years' War, recognized America's independence, so England declared war on France, and many good men in England begged for reconciliation, but none spoke up for appeasement when it came to getting along with the French. Spain chose France over the godless English, also declaring support for America, and Spain fought gallantly but vainly with the English fleet at Gibraltar, while the rest of Europe banded together against England to leave the British crown alone against the world. Motherland Russia and her neighbors, including Holland, Denmark, and Sweden, had grown tired of the British boarding their ships to search for contraband, and the British claimed to be looking for contraband of war, but the boarding, searching, and seizing had been going on for as long as anyone could remember. The British had defeated Washington at the Battle of Brandywine in 1777, but the British failed to follow up on the victory, and while the Americans lost the war militarily, the British were starved out by the presence of the French fleet and forced to surrender at Yorktown in 1781. America made Britain sign the Treaty of Versailles in 1783, also called the Treaty of Paris, that gave the Americans independence and left England 100 million pounds sterling deeper in debt. The Treaty of Versailles, signed by the British in 1783, gave Florida and the Bahamas to Spain as a thank you, and emboldened by the gusto of the Americans, the French would have a revolution of their own in 1789. Columbus had sent his brother to ask England's Henry VII to sponsor his journey, but had been turned down, and Columbus had made an offer to the King of Portugal twice, but was turned down again because the Portuguese had just discovered the Cape of Good Hope and no longer needed to sail west to find a shorter route to China. The King and Queen of Spain financed his journey, and Columbus had first landed on the Bahamas before reaching the mainland. And Columbus had followed the trade winds for 5 weeks before reaching the Bahamas, and he would sail to America a total of 4 times, each time believing he had reached China. The first Columbus expedition brought syphilis back in 1492, and a cure would not be found until 1943 with penicillin, and Jefferson had signed a contract with the Spanish in 1791, allowing Americans to travel on the Mississippi if they used only the eastern bank of the river, but many Americans just went and lived in the Wild West anyway, since there weren't enough Spanish around to stop them. The British built military bases on isolated islands like the Falklands and Bermuda, so wherever the British would sail they could find a redcoat or a red telephone booth that would lead them to the local commanding officer, who could point them towards a local bed and breakfast. But so much energy had been wasted by the English looking for the Northwest Passage to China and India, and a good many had died in the search. While Europeans had been on their way to Jamestown, they were shipwrecked on the 21-square-mile island of Bermuda that was 500 miles away from anywhere. After a 3-day hurricane crashed them onto the island, and Bermuda had been uninhabited, and the 150 Europeans from the shipwreck were forced to live on the island for almost a year before they built 2 boats from what was left of the ship. 2 people stayed behind to live on the island, one of them a convicted murderer, and one of the sailors going on to Jamestown would later marry Pocahontas, and when they arrived in Jamestown, everybody was starving to death. The captain promised to return to England to bring food back to them, but he died before even reaching Bermuda, and they buried his heart on the island and took the rest of him back to England, and his mission to save Jamestown went to the grave with him. The slave trade would make the island of Bermuda wealthy, and when the War of American Independence broke out, the people on Bermuda were British subjects but gave all the gunpowder stored by the English there to the Americans, even before a letter from Washington arrived with that request. 3 days after the Battle of Plattsburgh, an oversized American flag raised over Fort McHenry was seen by Francis Scott Key, who was being held prisoner on board a British ship of the line that had been captured from the French. and Francis Scott Key was inspired to write the Star-Spangled Banner poem that would become the American national anthem after it was set to the music of an old English drinking song. The Mayflower had sailed for America in 1620 with 120 Americans on board, and apples were imported from England in 1627, and apple juice was the color of clear liquid gold, and when left unattended in the open air, apple juice turned into hard apple cider. When the cider was left outside to freeze, the alcohol rose to the top that could be bottled as applejack or apple brandy, and because it was plentiful and simple to manufacture, apple cider was the thing to drink, and Johnny Appleseed became an American hero. Apple cider was twice as strong as beer and half as strong as wine, and drinking apple cider differentiated Americans from the rum-drinking British. Apple cider and other alcoholic drinks harbored fewer pathogens than plain water, and people who drank beverages that had been boiled during the alcohol-making process remained healthier, while water was considered fit only for animal consumption. Hauling water was an arduous, messy task, and water from the Mississippi needed to stand until a fifth of it settled to the bottom, and water in the winter had to be thawed, and it would not be until 1842 that an aqueduct was built in New York City, so people had something to drink other than water mixed with alcohol. In the old country, beer and cider had been made in monasteries by dedicated monks, so the early colonists respected these non-royal beverages and would seal a full bottle into the cornerstone of a church or a building to consecrate it. Tea cost more than milk thanks to the British tax on tea imports, and the temperance folks helped get the tax on tea cut in half, but people still didn't want to drink tea, and Americans made root beer instead with its minor alcohol content for storage, and they left tea drinking to, quote, the sick and those who, like British lords, were incapable of bodily labor, close quote. The Alcoholic Republic and American Tradition by W.J. Rorabaugh, New York and Oxford, Oxford University Press, 1979, page 99. Alcohol was used medicinally, and doctors gave alcohol to patients in the hospital, and at home alcohol helped to digest food that was often spoiled, and in the cities there was more free time to drink instead of just growing food and raising livestock, and the distinction between those who drank imported wine and those who drank homemade beer was a leftover from the days when pharaohs drank wine while their slaves drank beer.